So hello everyone, and thank you for joining us. And first I want to thank Heather Berry again for inviting us to do this session. And to Zhao and Samina, also really a warm thank you both for organizing this. And then thank you to all presenters and discussants for sharing their work and for reviewing the papers. And before I introduce them, let me just mention a few points on logistics. So to our virtual audience, please mute yourself during the session. And please make use of the chat feature. So write any comments or questions you may have. And when you write them, please put who the comment is for, either by putting the presenter's name or the number of the paper, for example, paper number 1, and then your question. And then when we get to the end, we will direct as many questions as we can to the presenters. And the chat will be saved, and then we can share them with authors. So we will greatly appreciate your feedback and thoughts. And our session will have 3 parts. First, we will have 4 presentations, back-to-back 10 minutes. And then this will be followed by 40 minutes for our discussants commenting on the paper. And then we have some time at the end for Q&A. For the presenters and discussants, at the 2-minute mark, I will unmute myself and then let you know that you have 2 minutes left. So to briefly introduce the presenters of this symposium, Arkady Sakartov from the University of Illinois, Hai-Jun Park from Penn State University, and Christopher Sabel from Norwegian Business Schools. And then we are very honored to have 3 discussants, renowned experts in our field, Andrew Shipilov from INSEAD, Tim Folta from the University of Connecticut, and Will Mitchell from the University of Toronto. And now, without further ado, I'll pass the floor to Arkady Sakartov, who will speak about resource redeployment in corporate acquisitions, going beyond horizontal acquisitions. Please, Arkady, you can start sharing your screen.
Hello, I'm Arkady Sakartov, and I'm presenting a new study co-authored with Jeff Rower and titled Resource Redeployment and Corporate Acquisitions. Resource redeployment is often defined as the reallocation of a firm's resources A to another industry or B to another firm. The 2 dimensions in which resources are redeployed motivated the 2 respective streams of research. On the one hand, withdrawal of a firm's resources from one industry and their redeployment to another industry within the same firm represents intertemporal economies of scope. Determinants and impacts of such economies were modeled theoretically and tested empirically. On the other hand, the withdrawal of resources from one party in a merger and their reallocation to another party in the deal that operates in the exact same industry was studied in research on horizontal acquisitions. Except for a few studies that implied redeployment in non-horizontal acquisitions but did not directly register such redeployment, the 2 dimensions of redeployment have been considered separately from each other. Meanwhile, business press presents some anecdotal evidence that acquiring firms combine the 2 dimensions by redeploying resources of targets to new industries. For example, Bombardier acquired Rotax, the firm that had previously built engines for Bombardier snowmobiles, and then redeployed the manufacturing plants of Rotax to the production of city trams. Furthermore, the phenomenon of acqui-hiring was exemplified with how Facebook and Google acquire firms, often from other industries, to subsequently redeploy those firms' human capital to new ventures at Facebook and Google. Finally, some nascent empirical research collected cross-industry samples that track employee mobility in corporate acquisitions, thus starting to focus on redeployment of labor following non-horizontal acquisitions. Responding to the nascent empirical interest in redeployment of resources following non-horizontal acquisitions, and to the lack of theory on resource redeployment in such deals, we aim to build a theory of redeployment that would more fully capture its properties. We do so by combining features of both dimensions of redeployment and by considering redeployment of resources between merging firms that may not be necessarily from the same industry. Accounts of important features of redeployment between industries date back to the seminal work by Edith Penrose, who classified such features into inducements and obstacles. Regarding the obstacles, Montgomery and Wernerfeld elaborated that relatedness between the industry from which the firm withdraws resources and the industry to which it redeploys the resources reduces the cost of such redeployment. In turn, our recent study with Team Folta operationalized inducements for resource redeployment with the current return advantage in the recipient industry, volatility of returns in the origin and the destination, and correlation of these returns. Essential features of resource redeployment between the merging firms are based on stages of the M&A process identified by Chowdhury and Tabrizi and the respective challenges. At the current stage of our project, we focus on the last two challenges. The first challenge we consider is the risk of adverse selection with which the acquirer is incompletely informed about the target and without undertaking due diligence can buy a lemon. The second challenge we focus on is linked to the integration of the target. If not facilitated by an integrative effort by the buyer, resource redeployment between the merging firms can be very costly and can generate inferior performance. We use a formal model to build a more comprehensive theory of redeployment. Like in previous models of redeployment, the evolution of returns in considered two businesses is modeled with the geometric Brownian motion. This model assumes that uncertain returns are more difficult to forecast the further an evaluator projects into the future. The specification also involves the three ramifications of inducements that were raised in previous research: the current return advantage, return volatility, and return correlation. Of course, in the context of our industry, I and J are industries in which the target and the acquirer respectively operate before the deal. They may not be necessarily the same industry. Without loss of generality, assume that the target's resources are redeployed to the acquirer. If we denote as omega I the proportion of the target's resources, the net cash flow the merged firm generates at the time of redeployment is this. This term in this statement is the cash flow the firm earns with resources staying in the target's business. This term is the cash flow the firm generates with resources that are used in the acquirer business. This term is the total redeployment cost modeled as a product of the marginal redeployment cost of a unit of resources, inversely capturing relatedness between the target and the acquirer, the amount of resources redeployed, and the current margin in the recipient acquirer's business to show the loss inefficiency relative to resources that were always deployed in that business. The valuation and the integration challenges are both linked to the marginal redeployment cost and are endogenously resolved by the acquirer with a decline in marginal utility of the effort of such resolutions. Thus, with the valuation challenges, the acquirer faces ambiguity about the redeployment cost and exerts some effort to reduce that ambiguity. In turn, with integration challenges, the acquirer knows the redeployment cost and commits some effort to directly reduce this cost. Let me now show some results. There are two groups of results that are based on the respective challenges in M&As. In those results, the horizontal axis will represent relatedness that exogenously reduces the redeployment cost because redeployment of resources between more similar businesses is naturally less costly. For each of the two challenges, three field counter maps are created to show the three ramifications of inducements: the current return advantage in the recipient business, volatilities of returns in the merging firms, and return correlation that are all placed along the vertical axis in the respective plots. The key difference of the 6 graphs from previous accounts of redeployment in horizontal acquisitions is that these graphs go beyond the marginal case. The target and the acquirer are from the same industry and which represent only the right margin of these 6 plots. Besides that, we allow the acquirer and the target to be from different industries adds the 3 additional predictors of the merger and acquisition performance. So what are the key takeaways from these formal results? We believe that we offer a nuanced account of how resource redeployment involved in M&As affects value realized by acquirers. Our account is not restricted to the case of horizontal acquisitions. The marginal case where the acquirer and the target come from the exact same industry may miss the context where resource redeployment creates most value. Redeployment of resources between strongly related merging firms adds more value than redeployment of resources when the merging firms are from the exact same industry. Thus, U-shaped relationship between the merger and acquisition return and relatedness. Besides, we established that regardless of the considered M&A challenge, volatility of returns in the merging firms monotonically increases the acquirer returns. Also, regardless of the considered M&A challenge, correlation of returns between the target and the acquirer monotonically decreases the acquirer returns. Finally, with the valuation challenge, the acquirer return has an inverse U-shaped relationship with the current return advantage in the destination for redeployment. In contrast, with the integration challenge, the acquirer return monotonically increases the current return advantage. We hope that those results will lay the groundwork for future empirical estimations in corporate strategy research and for better decision-making by corporate acquirers. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Arkady. Really interesting work. And I would now ask Haijun to share her slides. Haijun is presenting on knowledge domain competition and post-merger exits in professional firms. Haijun, looking forward to hear more.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you for having me in this symposium. I'd like to present a paper titled Internal Knowledge Competition and Post-Merger Exits in Knowledge-Intensive Firms. My co-authors are Forrest Briscoe, Brett Breimer, and Len Bierman. So in the current study, we introduce a new perspective to explain knowledge workers' exit decisions after a merger by unpacking the idea of internal knowledge competition. We are particularly interested in knowledge-intensive organizations where post-merger turnover is even more problematic. By changing the composition of knowledge workers, mergers trigger internal competition between organizational members. As knowledge workers have more bargaining power in this creation, their decision about whether they would stay or leave is driven by their own judgment, which is affected by competitive landscape inside the organization rather than top-down redeployment decision. Let me briefly introduce the background of how existing studies explain the post-merger turnover. Prior studies tell us that mergers increase employee turnover. However, we all know that employee turnover is, in general, problematic because turnover leads to human capital loss, which in turn decreases post-merger performance and erodes competitive advantage. To explain how mergers lead turnover, the strategy literature tends to focus on top-down decision-making for resource reallocation to pursue synergy by reducing redundancy. It emphasizes more firm-level drivers that are related to firm performance and organizational fit. There hasn't been as much thought on the idea that internal dynamics among individuals could lead to some misalignment between firms' intention of retaining human capital and individuals' agentic mobility choices in other contexts such as knowledge-intensive firms. Thus, we focus on knowledge-intensive organizations, specifically law firms, and aim to understand what happens to the knowledge workers when their firms merge. In this study, our context is law firms and law firm partners. Over the past 20 years, there has been a huge increase in the frequency of mergers between law firms. In law firms, mergers are not intended to increase efficiency. The law firms pursue growth by having more lawyers in various regions and legal expertise, who are the core assets of the companies, to respond to increasingly complicated demands of multinational clients. However, in many occasions, the mergers pursuing economies of scale end up in an opposite way. The negative consequence of knowledge workers' turnover is even more salient in knowledge-intensive firms, which rely even more heavily on individuals' human capital. In addition, knowledge workers' turnover decision is mostly voluntary, based on their high bargaining power over their firms and autonomy. Their higher bargaining power is based on the independent and unique nature of human capital and tight relationships with the clients. Thus, we bring in the internal competition perspective to understand partners' voluntary decision on stay or exit. We focus on knowledge workers' knowledge rivalry as a main source of internal competition because it affects their level of bargaining power. Rapid reconfiguration driven by mergers affect the level of trialing of some expertise and thus affect the level of competition in this knowledge domain. If there is increase in their knowledge rivalry, partners' chance of being successful decreases. Thus, we hypothesize that partners who experience a greater post-merger increase in internal knowledge rivals will be more likely to exit a firm. In addition, we also expect that rivals' turnover behavior influences knowledge workers' decision-making. As internal knowledge rivals leave the firm, knowledge workers perceive reduction in internal knowledge competition due to fewer rivals for resources and social standings, and are more likely to stay in the firm. Thus, we hypothesize that prior exits of internal knowledge rivals will decrease the likelihood of exit for the focal partner. Our data set includes partners in the 200 largest US law firms that experienced M&A between 1999 and 2012. This includes all the murder cases in this period between the 200 law firms. To better investigate the effect of internal knowledge rivalry, only those regional offices that actually have merged were included in our analysis. To implement the analysis, we used survival time event history model with merger fixed effect. And our dependent variable is a binary variable indicating whether the partner exited the firm within 24 months after the merger announcement. This is a summary of results predicting law firm partners' exit. For hypothesis 1, we measured the pre- and post-merger ratio of number of rivals in a focal partner's knowledge domains. The results indicate that the likelihood of exit increases by 12% for every 1 unit increase in the internal knowledge rivals ratio. Thus, hypothesis 1 is supported. For hypothesis 2, we used a time-varying measure reflecting the counts of prior exits of knowledge rivals. The result indicates that the likelihood of exit decreases by 8% for every additional rivals exit. So hypothesis 2 is also supported. In conclusion, I'd like to highlight key takeaways. First, we suggest a new perspective on post-merger turnover, particularly in knowledge-intensive firms, by unpacking the influence of internal competitive dynamics between individuals. We focus on internal knowledge rivalry and its impact on knowledge workers' turnover decision. To further expand this idea, we have been exploring how the attributes of mergers affect knowledge domain library. In addition, we can rethink about turnover spillover effect by suggesting that coworkers' exit behavior may be interpreted as a competition reduction event, and individuals pursue opposite decisions to their coworkers in certain contexts. For future research, it would be interesting to examine whether this negative spillover effect applies to other contexts where competition is activated.
Just as a reminder, you have 2 minutes.
Yeah, this is the end of my presentation. Thank you.
Wonderful, you did great on time, thank you. Well, thank you very much, Haidun. That's really interesting work, and we see lots of comments. Next up is my presentation. I will start sharing the screen. So thank you again for the organizers and for this opportunity to our audience for the interest. I am Julia Bodner, and I'm a PhD candidate in the INSEAD strategy department. And in my research, I focus on corporate strategy phenomena and the role of resource reconfiguration and redeployment in them. And today I share my job market paper project with you, where I look at a phenomenon at the heart of corporate strategy, firm diversification, and how it's linked with employee redeployment, and how to allocate resources, so finer grained elements of firms, is really important in corporate strategic decisions. And as the topic of this session suggests, I'm particularly interested about one specific type of resources: employees. And of course, the strategy literature has already focused on employees. They're one of the most important resources of a firm, if not the most important one, and repositories for knowledge. And there's a rich literature about how they move across firms. From the corporate strategy literature, we also learn that they're often internally redeployed, because all corporate strategic decisions mean to some degree that firms choose to internally allocate employees somewhere. And there is some work on intra-firm employee movement in geographically diversified firms, and really interesting work on internal labor markets. And more recently, some work has started looking at internal employee movements with a resource redeployment lens to add to that conversation by looking inside firms. And here, there's still some work left for us to do. And from the resource redeployment perspective, employee redeployment is the withdrawal of an employee from one unit so that the person can start working for another. In this paper, I focus on firm diversification. So the result of all decisions a firm makes about which businesses to compete in. And when and how diversification is done to create value is a highly debated topic, both in the strategy literature and in practice. And employee redeployment could play an important role in it. But we don't yet know how diversification is linked with employee redeployment in the first place. So let's say you're the manager of this firm with multiple units that are all active in similar business segments, say cars, trucks, and then more expensive cars. How do you think that firm would redeploy employees? And then let's think of a more diversified firm with the same structure where all units are active in different businesses. Let's say cars, but also paper production and energy. Where do you think we would see more movement? So my research question is, what is the link between firm diversification and employee redeployment? And it's not that obvious, because at first one might think, well, diversification, that means more distant, different activities in the same firm. But from the growing work on resource redeployment, we learned that redeploying resources and employees could be increasingly beneficial the more diversified firms are. So what has this literature said? It suggests that diversified firms can benefit from the ability to shift employees to where the firm thinks they're most useful. So in the example from before, if the paper industry has problems because the market declines, or if it has employees that it no longer needs because a new technology makes producing paper more efficient, that diversified firm may shift engineers or salespeople or managers to activities in the energy sector. And that's an ability that's also referred to as intertemporal economies of scope. And shifting around employees is also a way to recombine diverse sets of knowledge. and it can help to align diverse activities, spanning the boundaries between units. So as firms diversify, these could be the benefits of diversification. However, there are also higher costs tied to redeployment as firms diversify, because the specificity of employees relative to other units in the same firm increases, and that drives the cost of retraining employees and can constrain their redeployment. So what may be missing? One is the lack of large-scale empirical work, as I mentioned before, and then not all employees in the same firm are context-specific and costly to redeploy to the same extent. A nuance there that hasn't really been considered is where employees originate, the parent firm or subsidiaries, and where they're redeployed to. So in a simple multi-unit firm, you can see three types of employee movements: from parent to subsidiaries, across subsidiaries, and from subsidiaries towards parent firms. And the perceived costs and benefits that drive the redeployment decision, they might be different for the different directions. As firms diversify, employees in the parent firm have a broader understanding of the firm and lower within firm specificity than subsidiary employees. Diversified firms can redeploy them to subsidiaries because they do bring knowledge that extends what subsidiary employees already know, meaning that this is a direction of employee movement that does allow for both recombination and alignment with relatively low costs from the specificity of employees. My first hypothesis is that as firms diversify, the level of employee redeployment from parent to subsidiaries increases at the firm level. Subsidiary employees will be relatively more specialized as firms diversify, which may require more retraining if they are moved to other subsidiaries. But then this direction of employee redeployment, as firms diversify, offers more opportunities to shift employees to where they're most useful and to recombine their diverse sets of knowledge. So my second hypothesis argues that subsidiary to subsidiary redeployment of people should increase with diversification. What about the movement from subsidiary employees to parent units? Well, when redeploying subsidiary employees to parent firms, the benefits of recombination are lower. The parent would already know something about the subsidiary activities. And in addition, there might be increased costs of retraining due to higher specificity. And fewer of these employees will have a broad enough understanding of the other activities in the firm. And therefore, I predict that as firms diversify, they will redeploy fewer employees from subsidiaries towards parent firms. What we need to test these predictions is a direct measure of internal employee movements. And to do that, I'm fortunate to have data on about 2,000 Finnish multi-unit firms with information on subsidiaries and parents and how they're linked, and Finnish census data that allows me to track any employees in Finland that were transferred within the firms that I study, allowing me to look to some extent inside multi-unit firms. And what I present here are the results of my analysis so far. They're based on OLS models with firm and near fixed effects and firm level clustered and robust standard errors. And I control for time varying characteristics at the subsidiary, parent unit, industry, and firm level. Diversification is an entropy measure based on the weighted sales in different segments, and the dependent variable are the natural logarithm of 1 plus the number of people being redeployed in the various directions. To depict the results graphically, as diversification increases, parent to subsidiary redeployment increases, driven by related diversification, as you can see in the blue line. Across subsidiary redeployment increases as well as firms diversify, and this is true for both related and unrelated diversification. But as I expected, subsidiary to parent firm redeployment decreases, specifically with unrelated diversification, because fewer employees will have a low enough within firm specificity. Now I'm working on resolving some concerns that I have about improving the control group. I work on using matching approaches in the analysis and some concerns around endogeneity. So on ways to exogenize some variance in diversification For example, the Nokia downfall seriously disrupted the tech industry in Finland, and for firms that have subsidiaries in industries that are related to that, the level of diversification may change around that time. I also look at the types of employees that are moved, and I find preliminary evidence that the relationships are particularly relevant for knowledge workers and managers.
Julia, 1 minute left.
With this, thank you. With this work, I would like to contribute to 2 literature streams. First, the resource reconfiguration literature, by looking inside firms that can tell us something about how firms could develop the ability to change the resource composition on an ongoing basis. And second, I would also like to add to the conversation on diversification. Diverse firms may need employees who understand multiple businesses of the firm. And so this work may be a potential first step for us to then better understand how employee redeployment may interact with diversification to create value and innovation. And with that, now I really look forward to your questions and comments.
I hope everyone can see my screen. So for the final paper, myself, Christopher Sabel, a late-stage PhD student at BI Norwegian Business School, and Amir Sasson, also from BI Norwegian Business School, will talk about human capital redeployment and spin-out performance. What we mean by this, often when the word spin-out or spin-offs comes to mind, we think more about these individual entrepreneurial ventures founded by founders with experience. However, not only independent spin-offs are actually founded, but corporations themselves, like Google with Verily, or like a Norwegian example, the post office with a B2B service unit, are actually founding majority spin-outs, or also commonly known subsidiaries. Similarly so are actually large corporations supporting employees that choose to leave with minority equity stakes, just as INSEAD Networks and Adobe from Cisco and Xerox respectively. We call them minority spin-outs, given that the parent still holds a stake, an interest, and a continued relationship. An interesting question about this is what differentiates majority and minority spin-outs. While we might think that the majority spin-outs are by default the high-performance firms, adding Adobe here, which is now several times larger than Xerox, shows that corporates do not always know who the high-performance firms are. So it becomes quite existential to ask to what extent equity and human capital investment affect spin-out performance. How much does a parent have to contribute? We use a similar empirical context in EULA actually, because we have rich Norwegian registry data on all firms and employees from 2005 to 2015. We have detailed information on ownership, employee and firm characteristics, accounting, and employee mobility. So we construct a sample that looks at these small spin-outs, like non-listed majority and minority spin-outs that are in private for-profit sectors, which is about, in our sample, about 7,000 spin-outs and 30,000 spin-out years in 73 sub-industries. We do not choose listed or more mature divestments of firms because they are substantially different, given that they have access to the capital markets. Why are we interested in how human capital is redeployed from parent to spin-out and how this relates to performance? And prior research that looks at spin-out performance of owned spin-outs looks at relatedness and spin-out performance and gives it either linear, U-shaped, or sometimes also no effects of relatedness on the spin-out performance. They use relatedness as a proxy for resource transfers and find that a mismatch in relatedness can actually stifle the growth of a spin-out. However, they do not theorize on ownership per se, given that they often don't have the data. We theorize about informed redeployment, and this is where we want to disaggregate this relationship between relatedness and spin-out performance. We built on the research-based view and the knowledge-based views insights on diversification and performance in line with prior studies, but we actually disaggregate resource redeployment and relatedness. In this specific case, we also care about human capital redeployment as a transfer of tacit knowledge and analyze the properties of parent spin-out ties used to transfer these resources. So as a quick recap, we still think that relatedness affects the performance, but we look at how relatedness affects redeployment, and redeployment affects performance in turn. We further investigate two moderators in this relationship: the majority ownership, does it matter if you're a majority or minority spin-out, and social ties between parent and spin-out. A quick introduction to the key constructs that we're all on the same page. When we talk about spin-out performance, we talk about revenues, plain and simple. Our independent variable relatedness is a ratio that measures the relatedness between parent and spin-out industry, similar to other operationalizations. We do so by calculating the cosine similarity between two industries' workforce education profile on basically every employee in the industry in a specific year. Parent spin-out human capital redeployment is for us if at least one employee formally switches employment from parent to spin-out, and spin-out parent human capital redeployment, so the other way around, which we deem social ties, is if actually someone equally moves from spin-out to parent. Majority ownership is a binary variable indicating one if a parent owns the majority. Hypothesis a little bit more in detail, what we think is the direction of these hypotheses. In the first stage, as a resource-based view stipulates, underutilized indivisible resources create an inducement to diversify. So once the parent transfers human capital to a spin-out, they do so because they expect a positive performance gain. Given that human capital in this regard is a non-scale free resource that cannot be shared effectively at the same time, redeployment of an employee or sending of an employee is often the only chance. As prior research finds, resource redeployment is more likely with high relatedness, as redeployment costs are lower due to training or modification of assets. And additionally, research finds when firms diversify based on knowledge, the ability to redeploy often depends on the ability to redeploy the tacit aspects of knowledge, which is mostly inherent to employees. So we expect in the same way that parent spin-out relatedness positively affects the likelihood of parent spin-out human capital redeployment. However, and this might be a little bit counterintuitively, we expect that majority ownership negatively moderates this. Prior research finds that highly related spin-outs owned by the parent perform often worse than their counterparts. And similar other research finds that if spin-outs are perceived as too close, the parent is actually not able to get other investors such as venture capital or other corporate partners to participate in this explorative venture due to fear of expropriation. Thus, we hypothesize that actually spin-outs owned at majority that are also highly related might actually get less internal resources and have to fend for themselves at arm's length to actually alleviate these concerns of expropriation of external partners. Given that nowadays venture capital and other corporate venture capitalists' participation in these ventures is quite crucial, this can have a quite strong effect. To the next stage, we have a very simple baseline hypothesis that there is a direct effect of human capital redeployment from parent to spin-out on spin-out performance. There is a long list of potential studies we could cite here from the mobility literature and also from the resource-based view or the entrepreneurship literature that actually acquiring high-quality human capital with experience from established firm leads to improved performance of young ventures. However, in our specific case, given that it's from the parent, we hypothesize again that this is moderated by the ownership. Given that resource redeployment is most effective in internal factor markets due to reduced information asymmetries and reduced agency risks, and that also transferring tacit knowledge is more effective in internal labor markets and business group-like affiliations due to increased information about what is needed in the destination and less fear of expropriation, a majority ownership creates internal markets that are actually better at transferring tacit knowledge, kind of an informed redeployment. So here we assume that there is a positive moderation effect of majority ownership on the redeployment performance relationship.
Christopher, you have about 2 minutes left.
Yes. We additionally look at another important moderator that has to do with redeployment itself, social ties. Former employees are actually suited to facilitate knowledge exchange and create professional allegiance between two organizations. Similar to studies on ventures find that former employees can open up a channel between a venture and an established firm and create knowledge spill-ins. So what we deem social ties is actually a redeployment from spin-out to parent prior to the parent spin-out redeployment, which creates, again, this information channel of tacit knowledge that helps to create an informed redeployment, positively moderating the redeployment spin-out relationship. As the study is still in a nascent stage, we have a first draft of the empirical strategy and results. Here we estimate a two-stage selection model with a first stage probit and a second stage OLS, where the first stage estimates the likelihood of redeployment and the second stage redeployment performance effect. We include firm, industry, year, fixed effect, select independent variables. So it's robust to some extent. Some other things we're still working on, like, for example, a better instrument that captures more industry level effects. Our preliminary results from the first stage show that industry relatedness between parent and spin out contributes greatly to the potential of parent spin out human capital redeployment, as we expected. Similarly, is majority ownership creating a negative effect of this strong relationship? We find first evidence that there might actually be the case for this arm's length approach. In the second stage, we can see that redeployment is positive to performance, controlling for external redeployment, and also a bunch of other controlling effects. We similarly find that majority ownership and the social ties positively moderated. Next steps would be to address the unobserved heterogeneity even better with matching approach, and also look at alternative dependent variables and methods. So to sum it up, what we want to contribute to this and what we can learn from it, we want to contribute to the spin-out literature and create a more nuanced view on relatedness, transfer, and performance, looking more in depth at this proxy of relatedness for exchange, and show this by also including boundary conditions of the relationships. In addition, we also want to contribute to the resource redeployment literature, which often looks at acquisitions and majority ownership situations. We want to show that resource redeployment also happens in these minority stakes supported situations, but can have different boundary conditions. That's it from my side. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Christopher. Now we move on to our discussants that were so kind to look at our work. First is Andrew Shipilov from INSEAD, and he will give us comments on Haizoon's and Christopher's paper. Andrew, please take the virtual floor.
Hello, everyone. Can you see my screen? Hello, can you?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, can you see my screen with the presentation? Yeah?
Yes.
Okay. Very good. So I had two papers to discuss, and one of them was a presentation. Unfortunately, I didn't get to see the full paper, so forgive me for necessary incompleteness. It's more difficult to comment on the presentation than on the paper. But let me start with that nonetheless. And I think this is really good to collect feedback for your study at this stage, while you're sort of in the stage of transition from the presentation to a manuscript. And when I was reading it, to me, the first big question was, why would you focus on a merger? So what is a merger in your context? It seems to me that what you're studying here is a simple story. That is, if there is more internal competition, the more people will leave from an organization. So could we have hypothesized the same thing without the merger? And you seem to be saying in the presentation that merger attenuates the internal competition. But what I would really like to know is, what is the baseline from which it attenuates that internal competition? And I mean, I would have really liked to see some asymmetry in your theorizing and also in your analysis. And I've seen that some of the folks in the chat were also talking about sort of who is acquiring whom, and do you have more dominant party in the transaction or not? And one of the answers was, well, this is a merger, this is not an acquisition. But still, I wonder if you can exploit that, because otherwise, again, so why are we looking at this specific context? Why not look simply at a stable organization, the stable sort of situation? And would you not observe the same thing, meaning that the more people you have competing in the same knowledge domain as you are, you would be more likely to leave? So if you cannot find a dominant partner, then, you know, this comment is probably going to be mute. But still, the critical question would be, what do we get from the merger context in this paper? So now I was reading your hypothesis too. I was wondering whether there is some space for a U-shaped relationship there, because essentially and I'm thinking about a business school, for example. If we had some kind of a weird case, you don't even have to again go to the merger, one business school acquiring the other. But even in the steady state, so one could think that the more competition around a particular professor there is, the more this professor is likely to leave, in the sense that, I don't know, if everybody around me studies networks and you know, there's competition for a network dominance in a particular school, I may be more likely to leave. But that misses an important part, that I may also care about the community of knowledge in my organization. And I don't know to what extent this is true in a law firm, but I think that as human beings, as professionals, we do care about the community. So if I'm the only person in that legal practice, in that specialty in the law firm, even though my competition is zero, I may feel lonely, and maybe I will go to the law firm there. In fact, there are some people who have the same domain expertise that I can go and ask advice from. So what does that all mean? Well, that means that maybe there is a U-shaped relationship for age 2. Where you would have two forces. So internal competition, so clearly, as you say, there may be negative impact on future departures. But then maybe there's also a need to have the community of practice around the lawyers, and that maybe there would be some positive impact of future departures, increase in the past departures from the lawyers' practice area. And if you think that this sort of argument for the community effect is irrelevant for the theorizing, then I would say at the very least you would need to test for the nonlinearity as a post hoc analysis once you've done all the main ones, because this tension between being lonely versus competing against colleagues with similar knowledge, that strikes me as something that at least some of the reviewers may raise when you are going forward with this paper. Another thing which I'm pretty certain reviewers would raise, and I think some, maybe Asim and others have also raised this issue in the comments, is are departures voluntary or not? And at the very least, reviewers may ask that. And you know, your line of defense to this question could be, does it matter for your story? So if you do not have any asymmetry in the power in your theory and in your context, maybe it doesn't matter where the departures are voluntary or not. But if there is some asymmetry between players, you know, maybe one party is more dominant than the other because this is an acquisition and sort of less of a merger, then you would probably likely to see more involuntary departures from the less dominant firm or from the target or from whoever has less power in the organization, because people may be fired simply because someone else is imposing their will on them. And at the very least, I think you would need to find out a clever way to control for the motivations of people to leave. And at the very least, I would like to see a control for, you know, to some extent, if you would know where people are going, Can you know about the salary differentials? Is there something that could tease out the voluntary versus non-voluntary departures that would be good, assuming, especially if there is some power dynamic story in your study? So these were theoretical issues that I was able to pick up from the presentation. There are some, sorry.
Just so you know, you have about 3 minutes left, a little bit more.
Or for this paper?
Nope, for both papers.
For both papers, oh my God, okay. Then I will fast forward to the future research section, and since I'm a networks guy, I'm sort of worshiping the altars of Moreno, Who Shall Survive. And this is a great paper back out of the 30s, which said that people tend to live together. These were girls running from orphanages. But still, as a network scholar, I really like to know, are people leaving because they're friends? So could you have some control for social relationship between people who leave the organizations together? Now, in terms of the paper on the human capital redeployment and spin-out performance, I did have the privilege to read the entire work. And I think essentially your work is very interesting because you're essentially trying to conceptualize and test a moderated mediation model that links industry relatedness and ownership, redeployment of human resource and individuals' performance. I'll tell you the big picture of the paper. I like you bringing all those different constructs together, but what I was missing is a theoretical framework set up up front as to why you include specific moderators and also mechanisms as opposed to the others. When I was reading the front end, when I was reading the theory, until I got to the specific hypothesis, it was totally unclear to me why are you bringing this specific combinations of mechanisms for one hypothesis or the other. And you really need to have a very clear argumentation for your main effects. You want to have maybe one or maximum 2 mechanisms that you have used to argue your main effects. And only then you would move to interactions, because if you haven't clearly argued for the mechanisms translating the independent variables to dependent variables as main effect, you wouldn't know how the interactions would work. What really sort of worried me is that you have this 3-way interaction hypothesis there, which is not really argued. It's sort of stuck in the back of as an extra hypothesis. But these are tricky because 3-way interactions essentially imply synergies of the mechanisms. And since you haven't offered me a clear argumentation for the main effects on 2-way interactions, it's very difficult to think about what the 3-way interaction would be like. It would help to simplify. So your first hypothesis is pretty clear and linear. Knowledge relatedness leads to parent spin-out redeployment. In your second hypothesis, all of a sudden you're bringing the arguments about protection from expropriation from third parties. This was not foreshadowed in the beginning. I did not know what to expect, why those mechanisms are there. Why do firms care about third-party expropriation? Do they even have any evidence that they care? I liked a sentence in your argument for H3. So skills of management and founding teams are significantly related to performance in new ventures. This was just one argument. I hope you would develop a few paragraphs around it so that we know why parent spin-out redeployment to performance would be important. Then it became really complex for me. You've brought in the logic of fear of backward redeployment of human resources from the spin-out back to firm. That came out of the blue. I was slightly confused as I was reading H4. You were bringing absorptive capacity argument. That a little bit also came out of the blue. Then you had an argument about internal labor markets and business groups, again came out of the blue. So as a reader, I was really hoping that you would, in the beginning, set up a clear theoretical model. These are the mechanisms, these are lines and boxes we care about. And these would be the mechanisms for the main effects, and we will look at their interactions. My big challenge was empirical, and if you want, we can speak offline, but I don't think the 2SLS is the most appropriate framework there. It may not be the most appropriate one because essentially you have variables in the second stage, which should have been in the first stage to begin with. And I can send you these slides that go into a lot of details about your econometric specification, but I don't think you need the two SLS here. So Stata has this very good command called SCM, so structural equation modeling. And then there is this link that you can click. It's going to bring you to a website which tells you how to set up systematically moderated mediation models in Stata without the need for the instrument. And I think you can use your two stages as a potential setup, but given that you have interactions in stage 1 and stage 2, you're probably better off with structural equation models than 2SLS. You just are risking incurring a lot of reviewers' unhappiness with this kind of empirical setup. Anyway, to both, I will send you my slides and I will stop here.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Andrew. So next up, we are honored to have Tim with us. Tim will discuss Haijoon's My Own paper and Christopher's paper. So Tim, if you could take the floor, thank you very much.
Okay.
Wonderful, thank you.
I'll
remind you about.
Well, first of all, I have to say, can you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
I have to say that Samina and Heather and everybody, I think we're onto something here. I'm looking at the feedback the authors and the speakers are getting in the chat, and this is phenomenal. What great feedback. Secondly, Julia, I was under the impression I was supposed to do Arkadiyev's work and and not Haijoon's, so I did not prepare for that paper. So I apologize.
Correct, my mistake, sorry. No, that was correct.
But I was in the audience at one of the plenary sessions at SMS in Minneapolis, and one of the participants was Mike Roman, the CEO of 3M. He was an engaging speaker, and one of his comments really caught my attention. There's lots of research showing, he purports, that multi-business firms perform better when they're more active resource reallocators. I had a couple of immediate reactions to this statement. First, I was excited because it validated a research domain I've been exploring for well over a decade. The CEO of 3M is interested in resource redeployment. A second reaction was one of surprise. I was surprised because I don't think we have a good understanding of the specific hypothesis he put forth. Does the degree of resource redeployment affect firm value? The study I've seen that most directly relates to this question is a simple McKinsey quarterly article revealing through management surveys that dynamic reallocators have higher mean returns over a 20-year period than more passive reallocators. So how does the degree of resource redeployment affect firm value? In some sense, each of these papers is picking away at this question. So the Sakartov and Ryer paper. Full disclosure here, I was chair of Arkadiyev's dissertation at Purdue, and we have several papers together, and Jeff and I were colleagues and friends at Purdue. So I hope my comments aren't too off the mark. I've only seen a 4-page abstract of the work prior to this talk, and here is how I understand it. The work is pretty dense and complex, so it might be worthwhile to kind of simplify it. This is my simplification. Let's see if it's right. So M&As offer the opportunity to redeploy resources from acquirer to target and from target to acquirer. This potential for redeployment creates flexibility that should be recognized in a priori evaluations of the deal. Prior work has studied the factors driving the potential value and redeployability, but this work was general and not specific to M&As. In the context of M&As, it may be that factors driving up value through redeployability are endogenous to the factors that may drive down value by accentuating the lemons problem and integration problems. So they calculate a net effect of redeployability consisting of the theoretical potential minus agency and integration costs. So So if my understanding is correct, I would emphasize that it's very worthwhile to acknowledge these M&A costs should bear upon redeployability. While they're certainly recognized in the M&A literature, their determinants have not been linked to the determinants of the switching option. And this is critical because if the drivers of redeployability are intertwined with the drivers of these hazards, they can't be treated independently, and they have path-dependent effects. Consequently, to value them appropriately, these hazards have to be embedded in a real options model. The bottom line is that this paper gives us a better sense for the true potential of value creation through redeployment. Moreover, the model by Arkady and Jeff gives us a template for exploring its in contexts outside of M&A, how redeployability is intertwined with other hazards. One of the other things I like about this paper is that it's driving us towards practical use. With their help in potential M&As, we can better unpack which component of value creation is tied to redeployability versus leaving resources in place. So let me switch to the Bodner paper. First of all, let's distinguish between redeployability and redeployment. Okay, so resource redeployability is flexibility, which can be characterized as a switching option. Julia is interested in redeployment, which is the exercise of a switching option. So what factors influence when redeployment should occur? The literature suggests three: redeployment costs, inducements, and external transaction costs. And her paper builds upon this theory in several ways. So first, she suggests that we should not view inducements narrowly. They should not be confined to return correlation or performance differences or volatility. Firms should also consider that inducements might be characterized by the potential for lower communication or coordination costs, or more effective knowledge transfer, or improved understanding of organizational identity. These are real inducements. I want to emphasize that this is a novel contribution and very interesting. In some sense, we can broaden this argument to suggest that redeployment might help to create a dynamic capability for future redeployment. A second contribution is that the nature of redeployment affects in the inducements that are in play. So prior literature focuses only on redeployment between subsidiaries, but Julia suggests redeploying from parent to subsidiary affects a different set of inducements, and redeploying from subsidiary to parent affects other inducements. This is an interesting hypothesis, and I'd like to push Julia to provide more clarity around these relationships and why certain inducements are constrained to certain forms of redeployment. I don't completely understand why redeploying from parent to subsidiary affects communication costs, but a redeployment in the opposite direction does not. On the empirics, one of the challenges is adequately controlling for the inducements that are known in the literature. If you're trying to assess whether it's important to consider alternative measures of inducements, we should be sure to control for the traditional measures. And because your analysis is at the firm level, differences across subsidiaries is aggregated, making it difficult to control for return correlation or performance differences or volatility that are more accurately reflected at the segment level. So I must admit I'm a bit concerned also that your effects may not constitute redeployment effects. This is partly because you're using an indirect measure to proxy for your various inducements. It's also partly because I believe to capture the flexibility effect, you may need to interact your main variables with volatility, the key driver of the value of the switching option. Finally, I just want to draw your attention to the fact that your redeployment between subsidiaries is essentially a replication of prior work. It might be an important starting point to discuss the extent to which your work effectively replicates the few studies of this phenomenon. Obviously, the extent to which you have different measures affects replicability. So let me move to the Zabel and Stasson paper. So Chris and Amir. This paper studies redeployment from established firms to their spinouts. I love the fact that you're studying redeployment in the context of entrepreneurship and innovation. This in itself is novel, interesting, and important. Spinouts are one way firms explore, so there tends to be a lot of uncertainty around their eventual success. As we know, uncertainty drives the desire for flexibility. Because of this uncertainty, it might be hard for spinouts to hire employees who are unwilling to commit in the midst of employment risk. A cheaper alternative might be internal redeployment. The authors argue that human capital redeployment is more likely with greater relatedness. They seem ambivalent about whether this relationship is due to lower switching costs or greater inducements, because knowledge can be more useful in related spin-out. If you know this literature, the relatedness hypothesis is no surprise. What is surprising, however, is the focus on ownership. That is fascinating. Prior research in redeployment has assumed complete ownership of subsidiaries, but that's not the case here. Anything less than complete ownership might confound the ability to redeploy because managers in the established firm do not have full discretion. This is great. This reminds me of a criticism I've received of my own empirical work with Timo Sol in the retail industry, where there tends to be a lot of franchising in retail. The critics argued that surely companies have less ability to redeploy franchise stores than company-owned stores. Your treatment of ownership is better than that of Timo's and mine, but I would encourage you to take it a step further. There's a difference between ownership and control, and you're assuming that the two are the same. A growing body of work, mostly in finance, has proved that assumption to be tenuous. So a few comments on the empirics. It seems that there was redeployment in only about 4.4% of cases. This is very useful and interesting information, and I would encourage you to present more descriptive statistics like this. We really need to know how often our employees redeploy to spinouts. What is the distribution? Can you do some univariate analysis to see whether redeployment is higher for more relatedness? Our field is certainly heading in this direction of more descriptive statistics because it really helps the reader gain comfort in the data before providing a multivariate model. A second point, I suppose the likelihood of spin-out might be affected by the potential to redeploy. So this suggests a three-stage model might be appropriate. You might consider adding control variables related to inducements. You seem to have relatedness controls for switching costs, but there might be some added value to additional controls. I would encourage you to run a single-stage performance model with the intent to replicate prior research, because this is how other people have studied it in the past. Once you've replicated their results, you want to show how your theory and model change the outcome. This will give us a better sense for whether your theory is an improvement, and if you have successfully replicated, we'll have more confidence that your empirical approach is reasonable. In other words, we can then conclude that the results should not be driven by your data and measurement, so we can be more confident that it's driven by the theoretical mechanism you espouse. Very interesting contribution. So in closing, I think each of these papers drives us towards a better understanding of how resource allocation and reallocation contributes to firm value. Theoretical models like the type Arkady and Jeff presented help us better understand complex interactions and enable us to go well beyond intuitive argumentation. The efforts of Julia, Chris, and Amir draw our attention to factors influencing redeployment that have not been previously elaborated. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Tim, for really, really helpful comments.
Thank you.
Now we're on to our last discussant for this symposium, Will Mitchell, who will comment on Arkady's, Haidun's, and my presentation.
Cool. So let me quickly do a voice check. Julia, can you hear me? And anybody else, if you can hear me, stick your hand up or use your green dot, yes dot, to make sure that the voice is coming through. We'll assume you can hear me. Thanks. I'm just going to talk. I've prepared notes around the three papers I'm going to talk about, but I'm just going to, rather than spending the time on posting the slides and forcing us to read them, I'm going to talk it through. So let me start, Arkady and Jeff, let me start with your paper on redeployment and acquisitions. And you built a model that looks through, takes into account valuation challenges and integration challenges. You think in terms of relatedness, and you essentially have a result from the model that says economies of scope have greater benefits than either economies of scale or unrelated economies. And that's not particularly new, but it sort of gives us some confidence in the model. And then you talk about beyond relatedness, some benefits from volatility returns, and some constraints from correlation in returns, because you want to have some scope for variation. And then you work on some contingencies, valuation and integration challenges. And when the valuation challenges are high, we get a non-monotonic impact from current returns that are symmetric. And when integration challenges are high, we get a monotonic impact of current returns. So that's cool. But this is not exactly a but it's an important point. Models may be intrinsically interesting and elegant, but they're not particularly useful by themselves. They're not particularly useful for either theory or empirics, frankly. Not particularly useful for empirics because they abstract away so much. And they're not particularly useful for theory because they tend to be so focused that it's not clear what they say theoretically. The value models is what we draw from them. And here I do have a criticism about the abstract I received, which had a bunch of cool pictures and had one paragraph with all the results buried in a single paragraph. And this kind of reinforces the points that Tim made. So there's clearly something there, and Tim did a nice job of teasing out for us what's there. So I won't repeat that, but I'm going to push you on this, and you're both faculty, so you should be getting this at this point. It's the job of us, as each of us as an author, to tell the reader what's there rather than force the reader to figure out what's there. Partly that's just being fair to the reader, and it's partly because if you force the reader to figure out what's there, they're probably going to find something that you aren't interested in. So I'm going to push you really hard as you move this work forward. And I realize this is going from an abstract to a paper, and in the paper I know you do this. And Arkady, you certainly did part of this in the presentation. But it's the job for each of us when we're presenting any material, whether it's an abstract or a paper or a presentation, to be really clear about what's there. And I love the pictures. And I know there's the notion that a picture is worth 1,000 words. But I am going to say that I don't know if a picture requires 1,000 words to make it clear, but it does require at least 100 to 250 words to make clear what's there. Otherwise, it's just some cool colors, and it may help us relax, but it's not going to tell us what's there. So core ideas are cool. And the potential for drawing out implications sort of beyond our base understanding of redeployment in acquisitions is definitely there. And where I'm going to push you is to pick one or two spots in the midst of that paragraph. And Arkady, again, you got part of the way there with the presentation, and really push hard on them, rather than stop with some lovely pictures. So again, great start for the work, and lots of opportunities to push it forward. Second paper, Hyejun, Forrest, Rep, Len, your work on professional service firms, law firms, and post-acquisition exits. So a couple things I took away from this. One is acquisitions of law firms are common. Just that empirical fact actually is really interesting and important. Second is that turnover of lawyers after acquisitions is common. Again, a really important point. Now, I do want to push you on one point here. You largely assume that when we see turnover, this is disruptive. And this is a general point really about all acquisitions, whether it's professional service firms acquisitions or any acquisition. We sometimes assume that when people leave, that's a bad thing for the acquiring firm. The truth actually is that in many cases, the acquiring firm wants people to leave, and not only wants them to leave, but tells them to leave. So the challenge with acquisitions is not to keep everybody, but it's to keep the people you want. And frankly, I'll be blunt, tell the people you don't need to leave. And this is nothing saying anything about the quality of the people. They're often really good people, both in terms of themselves as individuals and their skills. But part of acquisitions is moving people around. And I've done some work with folks from Cisco who are really, really active in acquisitions. And they go into every deal with a really clear sense of who they want to keep and who they don't want to keep. And this is going to be true for law firms as well. So you've got three predictions, and one I'm going to call a static competition prediction, and two dynamic predictions. The static one is basically there's more competition, more exits. The dynamics are the more exits of peers, the fewer exits, and then there's a prediction around M&A overlap. And I think those are a useful start. You've got some empirical where the internal competition is based on overlapping practice areas, which is a nice start. But I guess I do want to push you on an alternative logic, and that again builds on the notion that exit might actually be desired by the acquiring firm as a way of reducing duplication. And so the key resource is less the technical area in the practice area, and this is for law firms in particular. It's less the technical knowledge of the lawyers in the practice area, because there's lots of technical knowledge. There's lots of lawyers that have graduated from the same schools and have the same understand the same technical area, and it's much more the client relationships in the area. And I realize that's really hard to get at empirically, but at least logically you've got to think it through. And so I guess I would have an alternative hypothesis that I would at least think about logically, which is that exits may well be partners with duplicated technical knowledge in the practice, yet weaker client relationships. And to the extent, at least think about that logically and then see whether you can work that into the empirics in any way. I think it would be a more robust study. It's a great start, and don't get me wrong, I really like it. There's just an opportunity to push it forward even farther. Third paper, Julia, your paper. Thanks again for presenting it. Second time I've seen it this week. Julia presented a piece of this work at the CCC conference over the weekend. It's great to see it both times and see it develop. I love the notion of redeployment, employee redeployment among firms, within firms, parent to subsidiary, subsidiary to firm, parent, sub to sub. I like the development of the mechanisms, the cost of control, coordination benefit needs, specialization versus generalization. I do a nice job of building on the redeployment literature. I want to put in a plug for the Karim and Capron work from 2016, which I think is really a wonderful summary of the redeployment literature to date. I guess, Julie, one thing I'd encourage you to do, you cite a fair bit of Charlie Williams's work. It'd be worth looking at one of Charlie's first papers in this space, a paper published in Management Science on the performance effects of redeployment within firms. And I know you're not looking at performance, you're looking at activity, which is great. But there's some logic in that work of Charlie's that actually can help you thinking through your hypothesis development. Hypotheses, H1, related diversification needs more from parent to sub because of control, with the mechanism is desire for control. H2, sub to sub, all diversification because of some combination of coordination and control. And H3, as related diversification goes up, sub to parent goes down. And this one, we talked a little bit about this last week, and I'm going to push you again on it here. I'm not 100% sure about H3. It's relying on basically fewer benefits for leverage because of unrelated diversification. And if you've got lots of subs with different skill bases, you get less opportunities for leverage. Therefore, you don't need to move people around. It's at least working through logically whether firms, at least in some cases, would want to move people from sub to parent when they have unrelated diversification in order to get greater understanding of the need for control at the parent level. And so since you've got the mechanisms of control and coordination, it's worth thinking about what role both of those play, not just coordination, but also control in the sub to parent relationship that you have in H3. And I know your results support the hypothesis, but I personally am more interested in the logic than I am in the hypothesis than in the results, because it's the logic that really helps us understand what's going on. Because anything can drive results. Just quick show of hands: how many of us have run models that have an infinite number of results in them and have to figure out which results have the strongest logical base? I'm going to put my hand up. I'm going to put a green dot on there. So if the logic ain't right, or if the logic ain't convincing, neither are the results. So I guess the last point I would make, and then I'll turn this over to general conversation, is it might be worth, because you've got this mix of coordination control, and because firms have to take both into account if they're going to operate well. And you use the example of Tata in the paper. Tata has both those needs for coordination and control, especially as it moves across the world. And Tata has 120 subs or something like that. And it can't let them all run completely independently of each other. Because as they try to develop the Tata brand and the Tata position across the world, a corporate position, they actually need some control as well as leveraging. So it might be worth looking at some joint patterns, where one type of redeployment might complement or substitute for the other, or where there's different combinations of needs for coordination and control that might shape your results. So again, this paper, as in the other two I looked at, I love where you are now, and I love just as much where you have the opportunity to go. So thanks for the opportunity to read the three papers and to listen to the presentations today.
Thank you so much. Thank you to all the discussants, to the presenters again as well, but to the discussants especially. This was really helpful. And I see lots and lots of comments in the chat. I just want to say, because time is a bit tight, and before we get to the questions, we thought it would be great if we could continue chatting a bit like we do at AOM when we continue talking during the breaks. Our presenters can all still hang out, so if you still have questions, I see a lot of reactions in the chat room, so in the chat box. So if you can stay, the presenters will remain for a bit, and then we can direct more questions to each, if that's if you have time. I'll direct some first questions to Arkady. Saw a lot of reaction from Anita McGahan. Anita, maybe you want to unmute yourself and actually clarify, because I see a lot of comments that you had.
Sure.
Thank you.
First of all, thank you very much. 3 great discussants and wonderful papers, and it's so great to see you all. You look terrific, and I'm thrilled to be part of this. Thank you, Samina and team. So for Arkady, you'll see in the chat, I had written a number of comments that very much reflect the discussants' advice and considerations. But one thing that might be particularly interesting to the group is I wonder if you could talk a little bit or offer some insights on how this equation, the central equation that's in your model, relates to the constructs that you had put at the beginning of your study on types of resources. I want to make sure I'm remembering exactly what you said those types of resources are, but inducements and obstacles from Penrose, can you align the model in words for us now with inducement and obstacles, and then talk about how both the model and the inducements and obstacles distinction relates to industry and non-industry redeployment. That might help us understand a little bit what exactly those pictures mean and your findings describe.
Yeah, sure. Thank you very much, Anita. First of all, I would like to refer for a careful reading of this topic to our paper with team. The question about how the equation parameters relate to the broader conceptual discussion of inducements and obstacles in Penrose. We tried to elaborate upon that carefully in 2015 article published at SMG. But briefly, obstacles emerge from unrelatedness when the target and the acquirer, or in our work with team, business I and business J within the same firm, have relatively dissimilar requirements to resources. In the language of Ramel's definition of relatedness, they are unrelated. It is more costly to adjust resources previously used in business I to start using them in business J. So this is exactly how it is operationalized in the equation. The more unrelated businesses I and J, the greater is the loss in efficiency, as Werner Feld and Montgomery defined it in their 1988 article, in redeploying resources from one business to another.
Or Katie, sorry to interrupt. I wanted just to ask you though, what is the logic for the redeployment if they're so unrelated? In other words, when I read Penrose, I thought that what Penrose was pointing to was that you have this overwhelming logic for resource recombination. Then there are challenges in the execution that are important and that may reflect the kind of diversity you've just described. But I guess what I'm asking for is just a sort of understanding of how industry and non-industry redeployment, why are those things different constructs than the constructs of obstacles and so on? So just help me understand the separation between the condition and the effect.
Well, this is actually the separation which Edith Penrose introduced in her book and reiterated in the separate article on how redeployment happened at the Hercules Powder Company. Obstacles is what precludes redeployment, what makes it more difficult, but this is not the only determinant of those instances. There is an opportunity cost of continuing to use resources in a business which performs worse than an alternative where the same resources can be used regardless of whether that alternative is related or not. So Penrose highlighted the interplay between inducements and obstacles. We believe in our paper with team in 2015, we believe that interplay between inducements and obstacles went a little bit unnoticed in Penrose's work. So we wanted to re-emphasize that in our 2015 article by saying, relatedness is very important, but our article is named Getting Beyond Relatedness.
Yeah.
If J performs much better than I, maybe even high cost of redeploying from I to J will not preclude the redeployment because J performs so much better than I. So the consideration of them together, how costly is that to redeploy, which is obstacles, and how attractive the redeployment is intrinsically, which is inducement when J performs much better. It is important to consider them together. This is why we name our article Getting Beyond Relatedness, another article, 2015 at SMG.
Yeah.
But this idea, which is, it is repeatedly mentioned in Penrose. It was probably not stated explicitly enough to be appreciated and noticed up to the extent to which we believe it deserves.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Thank you both very much. Maybe a question directed to Haijun that Dimo Ringhoff brought up, whether you would think that the effects differ for target versus acquire workers, and whether you're able to distinguish between exit by target versus acquire knowledge workers. Is Haijun still here?
So you were asking any effect between target and acquiring and acquired firm, right? Yeah, I think it could be possible. So maybe we can think about how prior exits from from the target firms and acquiring firms can have different influences, or the competition effect also can be different. So we are working on looking at those differences as well. So that would be good add to our paper in order to develop it. So
nice. Okay. I see that Aldona has a raised hand. Aldona, do you want to unmute yourself and ask your question?
Yes, I had a very quick question to Christopher. So first of all, great to see this paper that developed in the past few years. I was wondering whether you thought about actually splitting this into a couple of papers, because like Andrew, I had a hard time following the moderation effects and understanding the logic why you're bringing them up. And I was wondering whether you would be better off with 2 papers.
Thank you for the comment, Aldona. We have actually thought about it. Given that there is a lot going on for only 1 paper, so far one effort in this is actually to look at whether relatedness drives a specific type of redeployment. So whether more specifically trained workers, because we also have job categories and education categories, so we know what the people are actually doing in the firms or what their structural position is and what they have been trained to do. If, for example, relatedness would drive more workers with a general education or with more specific education, and whether there is a discrepancy. This was one thought, to actually make this more homogeneous, and then in a second paper focus more on the performance. 1 behavioral paper, 1 performance paper. So yeah, in short.
Okay, are there any other raised hands? Anyone that wants to make comments that maybe are not in the chat box? Because the chat box comments, we can share them and parse them out later to each of the authors. If you have a comment that wasn't shared there. I see a raised hand by Abu Rehan. Did you want to make a comment?
Agnes?
Agnes, yeah.
Okay, everybody hears me? Okay, my comment is actually for you, Yulia, and based a little bit on Samina's comment, which is how firms diversify, whether that affects how you would redeploy. And there the idea is also whether, because now you're not controlling for excess of employees. So let's say a firm redeploys via acquisition, and we see a lot of excess employees exiting with the acquisition. Thus, we would probably assume that there is higher need for redeploying some of them. So there might be, at least to control for exit of employees in the receiving unit, or also, I guess, because you have the data. So at the moment, I guess you control for the total number of employees within the units. So looking at also who, like, what's the turnover in the receiving firm might be another thing.
But just to clarify, you would control for both people exiting any of the units and people joining the units, right?
Yeah, I guess because you have, so ultimately I would rather have it on the subsidiary level, but because you have the analysis on the firm level and not on the subsidiary level, so first probably I would weight it by subsidiary size, because I guess the Finnish data is pretty similar to the Danish data, and then we see a lot of differences in, so both the age of the subsidiaries, but also the size of the subsidiaries. So weighting it by that might already help, and then see, okay, if in the year there is a particular high spike in exits, maybe there's something going on, and I guess you also have the data for the acquisitions.
Okay, nice, thank you. There was a comment for Heidem by Elena Vidal. Elena, did you want to elaborate further? The question was about, is it scale or scope as well?
Yeah, I think my comment was about, because in law firms, you know, one of the arguments that she made was that they're expanding or merging in order to increase scale, but because law firms also work, you know, they practice different types of law, it might not necessarily be just scale, but also the different scope in the different areas of law. So we may be seeing changes in the composition of the partners because of the strengthening or weakening of the different departments that they have. So it might be an opportunity to explore, if you have access to that data, to see not just the impact of scale, but also the impact that scope may have on this mobility.
Yeah, thank you for your comments, and I think that's really good add to our models. And I truly agree with you that maybe firms may be concentrated in certain expertise area, but also some other firms are trying to expand the legal expertise. So that variance can have some influence in our theory and story. Thank you very much.
Anyone else have questions that they want to raise over the microphone to any of our authors? Or comments?
Hi, this is Anita.
Go ahead, Anita.
I just wanted to ask a little bit about the format that we have here of doing these symposia. Can one of the leaders of the division just say a word or two about future opportunities to engage like this?
Sure, thanks, Anita. You know, when we found out that AOM was going to be virtual, and because of its nature, in a crunched period of time, we're offering during the conference only 10% of the content as synchronous and real time. We thought we have a lot more flexibility if we go beyond the dates of just the annual conference.
Perfect.
And then we can also adjust for different time zones and for actually the presenters. They need to be there, right? And so we thought, let's have more of these symposia. We're going to have a few PDWs hopefully next month, where we try to work outside the constraints of just the annual conference to keep our membership active. And one of the things, Anita, you've given me a moment to give a plug for, is this month we have something called Coffee Wishes. So for all junior faculty, so PhD students, assistant professors, postdocs, and even associates should apply. If you want to speak to a senior faculty member about your research or just advice about your career, it's a great way to get to know someone and get advice. So on our division page, you can look at our feedback, all of the different things that we're doing, but that's called Coffee Wishes. And you can talk to Anita McGann. She's on that list.
Yeah, I just want to emphasize that another reason for doing these was that we thought, well, during this COVID crisis, people, you know, they need intellectual stimulation, and it might help draw us together as a community. And so even before we had the outcome of what AOM was doing, we were kind of brainstorming about this. And Samina has really done a fabulous job leading, and Heather's done a lot of the legwork in putting this together. So it's been great.
I mean, I think these are fabulous innovations that we should continue to have even after the restrictions are lifted.
Agreed, and we don't have to travel, and we can be in our pajamas on the way down.
I mean, I think it's great to be in person too. There's value to that, but I could see a model where we do this way every other year. I don't know. I don't know. We'll have to see how the main conference goes, but anyway.
Right.
The wonderful thing really for presenters is to have access to all the comments as we're speaking, have an insight directly into what the audience is thinking as we speak. It's very, very valuable. So I agree with Anita.
This reminds me that we will look at the chat and parse it and give the we'll give it to Julia, who can then distribute to the different authors the comments that you've received on the chat box. And feel free, I think, to follow up with different people who gave you those comments. So Julia, any final comments from you?
No, I just want to thank everyone for joining this, and you and Zhao for organizing it, Heather for the wonderful idea, and all the discussants for joining in this new version, which was, you know, more effortful in terms of all the emails that they would receive from me. I flooded them, and the presenters as well. So thank you so much.